doing? Let's just quickly, for everyone who's just joining us, and just as a quick review, because I realized I didn't really give a big picture at the end of last week. Here's a timeline of where we've been so far. So year zero, you have the church starts, and for the first about 400 or 500 years, we're not really concerned about what happened because for the first several hundred years, the church was largely small meetings in people's homes. They would have a meal. Often they would sing songs. How did those songs go? We don't know. Why? Because it wasn't written down. We didn't have sheet music, so we actually don't really know how that music sounded, so we're not really concerned about it. But around 400, 500, the church fathers show up. You have people like St. Augustine, and they have a lot of opinionated ideas about how the church is going to be run and organized going forward. Church meetings start getting bigger. We have basilicas for the first time, these large buildings, right? And because we have these large buildings, the spoken word often is going to get lost. These microphones didn't exist back in those days. And so we're going to have monophonic music, which I'll get to that in a second, which is going to make the words easier to understand. It's the Middle Ages. We're not worried about how the music makes us feel or emotion. That is, the Greeks thought about that. We are not concerned about it. Gregorian chant shows up around 700. How did Pope Gregory contribute to that? He didn't. Attributed to him, had nothing to do with it. Neumes was the first notation in about 900. And that was, remember, up until this point, music was completely learned by rote. It was completely learned by, you had to memorize it. And people who sang music, it was all professional choirs, and has been professional choirs, no congregational participation in the Catholic Church. So they're learning hundreds of songs and memorizing them to be in these choirs. 900, we have neumes, which are little markings that kind of help us remember how music goes, but it's not real notes, so we still have to know it by memory. About 1,000, we have complete notation for the first time, so now we don't have to memorize the music. By the way, Western culture is the only culture that came up with that. 1100, we have organum, 1200 polyphony, 1300 ars nova. Let me hit those really quick. So first, monophony. What does monophony mean? One voice. One voice. Why was it one voice? Well, and no instruments either. We hadn't really invented harmony yet, but the other thing is that the early church was really concerned about music being enjoyed for human pleasures. And it was all about focus on God and God alone in the early church. And so anything that was too decorative, and that goes for music, it goes for decoration in the church. Anything that's too decorative, look at this very basic building. This is one of the first basilicas. Paganism. Dance numbers, big choirs, big showstoppers, paganism. So here's monophony for you. And that is how music sounded for about 1,000 years. So around the 12th century, we finally decide, well, so first of all, we get into Gothic architecture for the first time. And churches are going to be grander and grander. The church itself has evolved. Now we're getting into, the church has a lot more political power than it used to. The Western Empire fell. The Pope assumes control, basically, of what's left of Rome. Charlemagne unites Europe, and all of a sudden the Pope has political control over a lot. And now the church symbolizes God's power. And we're going to make the churches bigger and grander, and we're also going to make music bigger and grander, which means we're going to start inventing harmony. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add like 1 or 2 extra notes. It's the exact same thing. It's just going to be starting at different pitches, so we kind of start to get something different. It's called organum. It sounds like this. Finally, about 100 years later, y'all remember that, right? We sang that last week. Finally, around 13th century, we get real polyphony. And what this is, we're finally going to break out and we're going to have true separate parts. And we're going to sing different words at different times. And it's going to be real, this polyphonic texture and this kind of tapestry of different notes going in and out. And it sounds kind of like this. Now remember, this is Middle Ages harmony. Sounds kind of weird, right? Almost kind of alien. It's very different. So we invented harmony, and this is on the continent. So this is France, Germany, Italy. They're all kind of doing this routine. And so the English show up in around 1300, and they're going to have a 100 Years' War. And the English say, hey, while we're kicking your butts having this war, we want to share with you the harmony that we've come up with. And it actually sounds a lot nicer. And the French are like, oh, wow. We should do that too, and we're going to call it the Ars Nova, which is Latin for new art. And now all of a sudden we're going to have this much prettier sounding music. It's a lot prettier, right? It's all about the intervals. It's if I sing this note, what note are you singing? And the Ars Nova, go ahead. No, women still aren't allowed to sing yet. Unless it's in a convent. Usually it would be boys singing soprano. And now this is 3 parts by now. We have the tenor, which is kind of your bass line, and they're singing the melody or the original chant, and then you have 2 decorating voices, sort of like an alto and a soprano part. These 2 decorating voices that are singing above. So it's like a tenor, which is the melody, and then 2 descants. Yes, sir?
So would those all have been males we were just hearing?
I don't think that recording was.
And another question, that previous one that we heard that was kind of weird, it didn't sound like they were using words. Or were they just going dee-dee-dee-dee-dee?
They were using words, but they changed words and syllables very, very slowly. And that's actually where melismas come from around, I'm glad you asked. Melismatic material, it's like, for unto us a child is born. For unto us a child is born. And we call that melismatic material or melismas when you keep the same word, but the notes continue. And so they were doing a very long melisma.
So that was one long word.
Yes. So that is where we ended last week. And the Ars Nova is, with the 14th century, as far as music is concerned, kind of signifies the end of the Middle Ages on the continent. And we go to the Renaissance, now, which is a rebirth. Now, for other art forms like painting and sculptures and things like that, we found the old Greek stuff, and we're like, hey, let's copy that. Let's paint like the Greeks did. Let's sculpt like the Greeks sculpted. And let's build things like the Greeks built things. And we're going to make, we're not really copying them, that's not fair, but we're using that style. Music, we couldn't really do that. Why couldn't we do that? We didn't know what it sounded like because it wasn't written down. We hadn't invented sheet music. The Greeks were not smart enough to do that, I guess. So, oh well. So what we did was we took inspiration from Greek ideas. What did the Greeks think about music? We can enjoy it. Both Aristotle especially thought that. Did I hear another one? Yeah, Plato was more about music's effect on the ethos, and that any type of music should inspire betterment of oneself and inspire closeness to divine power. So the other thing about the Greeks is that they believed that different types of music could trigger different emotions. Remember, that wasn't really what the early church and the early mass, the music was about. It was all about making the notes, making the words more clear, and then through added polyphony, it was about making it grander and bigger and showing the power of the church. It was a very much kind of a political thing. The Greeks believed that different types of music could cause different types of emotions, and that is where we're at now with the Renaissance. So the other thing that happens in this period is that you have a lot more traveling. So you have these cosmopolitan musicians and this development of an international style based on the consonance anglois, or that English consonants, that pretty music that we just listened to. That is the harmonic style that's going to make it into all music during this period. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to go from 3 voices to 4, adding a bass and mirroring what we have today with soprano, alto, tenor, bass. The tenor is still the melody. So now you have pretty much throughout this entire phase, you have the tenors that sing the melody, the soprano and altos that have two decorating descants, and then a bass is going to give a little bit more at the bottom. And I actually want to play a little bit for you. I just run up here. There are only 2 videos tonight, but I wanted to give you the score so that those of you that read music can also follow along. So one of the most popular Renaissance composers was named Josquin de Prez, and this is a composition by him, and you can see the 4 voices, and this is polyphonic, using that very pretty harmonic system, the consonance anglois. So that is one of the most popular composers of that period. You can hear the polyphonic textures, the different voices that move in and out from each other. Any thoughts on that? What'd you hear that's a little bit different? Hmm? A lot of times. So the way it works, in order to, you would actually kind of slow the melody down. And there's a melody coming up that you'll recognize, and it'll better illustrate that.
So, a couple questions. Was the subject matter
For this guy, yes.
Yeah.
But for the first time, secular song also becomes important, and there's a very specific reason for that I'm about to get to.
Okay. Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So you said earlier, I mean, it sounds like this is advancing a little faster because there's written music. And notation, did it look like that? Pretty much what we were looking at?
No, not yet.
Yeah, okay.
Not quite. It's getting close.
But they had half notes, whole notes, stuff like that?
Either half notes and whole notes, or things that related to that, or things that were precursors. We actually looked at an example last. I should have brought that again.
Did you say that no one else in the world was doing this at the time?
Western Europe was where sheet music was.
Wow.
Yeah, we invented sheet music. The Western culture invented sheet music.
So
Everywhere
else, it's just like by ear.
If you look at Africa and all the places in Asia, Indonesia, we listened to gamelan music last week. That was a big deal. Native American culture, of course, has its own music tradition. But what we are hearing right now, what is unique to Western music, polyphony, these different parts weaving in and out, and the relationship between them, composition as an art form that is apart from composing because of the invention of sheet music. Those are the big things that define Western culture. Now later, and we'll talk about this next week a little bit, we'll get into some of the fusion styles. So, of course, eventually African music made its way to the New World and blended with Western tradition, so you get the rhythms of African music, but this harmony, the harmonies of Western music, and that is where African American spirituals come from. There's another one. Oh, eventually you get the kind of this European march. The march hasn't been invented yet, but eventually there's a European march. This very European march style is blended with African syncopated rhythms. What comes from that? Precursor to jazz. Ragtime. That's it.
Michael?
Yes, sir.
You haven't talked, basically you said during the Middle Ages, instrumental music was not emphasized in church music. Is that correct?
It was disallowed in church music.
So, but in the Renaissance, there was instrumental.
By the way, and that happens, that it kind of creeps its way in, kind of like polyphony. So when Notre Dame was built, there was pipe organ, and then they put a bigger pipe organ. So by the end of our last adventure, you started having organ music make its way into the church.
Well, my question is really leading to, Renaissance was also the age of exploration. There was a lot of money pouring into church coffers and royal coffers from the New World, a lot of gold, plating and things, and a lot of patrons of the arts, music, I suppose, right, and painting and sculpture and things like that, because they weren't selling them on the street corners, they were selling this stuff to rich people.
Right.
Or rich institutions. So, I don't know if you have any comment about that, how it related to music.
We're going to get there. Yeah. So the next thing I want to talk about, because this actually kind of relates to secular music and also instrumental music and folk music. So Mark asked a question last week, what about folk music? We don't know a whole lot about folk music during the Middle Ages. Why is that? It wasn't written down. So what happened? So we had sheet music, but how much sheet music did we really have in the Middle Ages? Around 1000, AD 1000. Not a lot, because it was all handwritten. And because it was all handwritten, it took forever. It didn't go very far. If only someone would come up with a faster way to make the music. Oh, look at that. So now, this is actually really, really important. Now, music can be printed a whole lot more quickly. It isn't just, sheet music is no longer limited to the rich Catholic Church. It is now pretty much available to everyone. For the first time, amateur musicians and your folk musicians can get your hands on sheet music. Folk music is printed for the first time, which means now we have a record of what that sounded like. It gave composers new possibilities in terms of how they can live their lives. They can work for a court, they can work for a church, or they can print their music and sell it directly to publishers. And it also cemented the role of sheet music in Western music. And it really cemented the role of sheet music in Western culture as a whole. Let's talk about the Catholic Church. Speaking of gold plating and riches and sale of indulgences and so a lot of people are getting to the point where this is the Renaissance. People are starting to grow brains, and people are realizing, wait, this isn't okay. Take our friend Martin Luther, for example. There we go. He's got 95 problems, and the church is all of them. And also, he's a musician. He writes, and he sings, and he plays both the flute and the lute. So he's really big into music. And he comes up with some ideas about maybe how the church could be run a little bit better. Specifically, he comes up with about 95 ideas and wants to have a friendly conversation with the Pope, and the Pope excommunicates him. So, I guess we'll have to start our own church. Now I've got a lot of free time. I'm no longer a monk working for the Catholic Church. I've got some spare time, and I guess I'll start my own. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have the congregation sing. Isn't that something? Yeah. And is it going to be big polyphonic grand music? No, it's not. They're not trained musicians. They're congregants. What do we sing in church? We usually sing in unison. Actually, other than choir members, does anyone here sing a part other than the melody in church? No, of course not. So that's what they're going to do. And it's all monophonic, and it's going to be monophonic chant, except we should find something that's more German than chant. We should find kind of a German-ish word. So we're going to call it a chorale. And that's where we get our chorale in the main musical canon. We're going to translate it to the vernacular. Is it all going to be vernacular? No, we're still going to keep some Latin because Martin Luther likes Latin. He likes to educate people with Latin. And he writes a very, very, very popular hymn, one that you all know, called Ein feste Burg. Can anyone translate that? A mighty fortress is our God. And it sounds, and we're going to sing it monophonically, and it goes like this. Nice and simple, right? Is it kind of easy to sing monophonically? No. Kind of. For the people at the time, yes. I understand why you say no, though. Is it terribly interesting to sit and listen to? No. So Martin Luther said, well, we're going to have congregational singing, and it's going to be nice and simple like that so everyone can participate. But, depending on the size of the church, we're still going to have choirs. And we're going to have more interesting polyphonic music. Sometimes it's going to be in Latin. Sometimes it's going to be in the vernacular. And we're going to have these 4-part polyphonic pieces. So you have these other composers that take these melodies that Martin Luther wrote, and like our friend Walter here, and he takes that simple melody, and this is where it's a little bit a little bit slower. He's going to slow it down a little bit, and then he's going to put stuff on top. Now it's in the tenor, so watch for it. And he's going to decorate it with faster notes. There we go.
Two tenor parts, like that.
Yeah, so a lot of times the first part's called the tenor, and the line above that is called the countertenor. Quick show of hands, who has heard the word countertenor? Yeah, so a countertenor is a male alto voice.
It's falsetto, is it?
It can be, yeah. So that's the sort of thing that a Lutheran choir, if you had a capable choir in a Lutheran church, that might be the sort of thing that you might hear. So Luther and his colleagues wrote pretty rapidly, and they wrote over 700 new songs. And this, I didn't put this on the slide, but this happened by about 1600. Yeah. So by the end of the century, there were 700 new songs in German for the Lutheran Church. Yes, sir.
If I could go back a little bit, it sounds like the advent of sheet music allows for this four different things to be happening at once. Like maybe the human brain couldn't have done this kind of complex view. There's basically four different songs overlaid. I mean, without writing something down.
So in 2024, you are absolutely right. And I am very happy to say that. I will say in 2024, musicians, especially musicians who have graduated from public universities and big universities, were very careful to say my art is more complex than your art, because other cultures do not have this level of complexity. So it's an interesting conversation, but I agree with you.
Yeah, and I'm not saying better or worse.
No, of course not.
But maybe very difficult to do without writing.
I don't think it would have been possible, because he would have had, I think you're right, because he would have had to imagine having to memorize that. Or imagine having to write that without the ability to see what you've written so far. So something I should mention for everyone, just as a reminder from last week, before the advent of sheet music, music was written using kind of preconceived formulas, right? And also polyphony didn't exist before sheet music. So before sheet music, all we had was monophony. Because how in the world would you memorize a whole bunch of different parts, kind of weaving in and out, not even to mention inventing the harmony in the first place, without being able to go back and see what you wrote? Good point. It's actually around this period. So that is one of the things about the Renaissance in painted art and sculpture. The Greeks could do it, and then partly civilization forgot, partly we had bigger problems and didn't really care anymore. But all of this kind of advanced three-dimensional painting and sculpted art was lost for 1,000 years. So now, did the Greeks have more advanced polyphonic music? Who knows? Didn't write it down. So for our purposes, this is the first time that we have this really interesting music. So the Lutheran Church wasn't the only church that existed. We also have our friend John Calvin here. Oh, now John Calvin's really interesting. He's kind of like a grumpier version of Martin Luther. Look at him. He looks like Grumpy from Snow White. No, he really was. So he comes along. He's from Switzerland, so I don't know what he has to be grumpy about, but he kind of agrees with Martin Luther. Catholic Church has kind of done some awful things, and he's a little bit different. He believes in predestination, so that's fun. But he was really all about focus on God alone, and we're going to strip all the decoration. The Catholic Church has gotten too big for its britches. They've got all this gold plating and all the coffers and we're going to get rid of all of it. No more polyphony, no more choirs. Everything's going to be monophonic. Who does that sound like? Who we talk? Not Plato, yes, but in between. St. Augustine and the church fathers in 400, 500, when all this first started. So all of this decoration and money and organs and polyphony have been kind of creeping its way into the church the last couple hundred years, right? And John Calvin takes a look back and he's like, wait, what happened? So all that's got to go. The other thing he doesn't really like is people writing original texts to be sung in church. So like Martin Luther, he's writing his own poetry. And it's all to the glory of God. And not only is it the glory of God, he's writing his own poetry that specifically reflects his beliefs and what the Lutheran Church teaches. John Calvin is like, well, that's not biblical. That's not in the Bible. We're not going to sing it. We're only going to sing psalms. Well, psalms are kind of hard to sing. They're written as songs, but kind of in the way we want to sing them, they're kind of hard to sing. So how are we going to make them easier to sing? Well, we're going to make metrical psalms. We're going to change the words a little bit sometimes if it means it's easier to sing, but it's going to be heavily based on that, and that's all they did. The most famous one is the tune for Psalm 134, which I'll play for you here in a minute. And also, you guys heard the Bay Book of Psalms, 1640? The first printed book in North America, which was printed in Plymouth. So the Calvinist church, they became the Puritans, they became the Presbyterians, they went all over Europe, and they became a whole bunch of different traditions. So the Pilgrims that sailed to Massachusetts were from that lineage. And so they had their Book of Psalms, which is also called a Psalter, which we have in the hymnal. If you look at our United Methodist hymnal, probably like 800-ish, somewhere in that. Yeah, we have a whole Psalter in the hymnal. So here's the tune for Psalm 134. You'll recognize this. Notice how they pause. So that's Psalm 134. It was later translated to English, but for some reason, I don't know, it was not translated as Psalm 134. It was translated as a different psalm. Different psalm first. 100. And that's why in the English, it was translated to Psalm 100, and that's why we know that tune is the Old Hundredth. And then we started using it as the doxology, and we put harmony to it and all that other good stuff, and the organ and stuff like that. So that is the Calvinist tradition, and that is what they had to contribute to the church. By the way, even today, there's still churches, and so we think of that as kind of this weird, like, huge reversal, like, oh my gosh, we're not going to have instruments, we're not going to have any of this stuff, no parts. That was the early church. That was the fathers of the church, St. Augustine. That's how the Catholic Church started. It was focused on God alone, and it was all this other stuff that kind of crept into church doctrine as the centuries passed.
So theologically, what is his problem? He doesn't want sensual feelings and pleasure or anything like that?
Yeah, so this all started with Plato. And Plato, well, Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle believed two things. One, music could be used, music inspires, it affects the ethos, and inspires kind of this closeness to divine power, and you can also just kind of enjoy it just for music's sake. Plato also believed those things, except he believed that it was almost kind of a sin to enjoy music for its own sake. You should only be using it for that higher purpose. So when St. Augustine and the church fathers come along at like 400 or 500, they are taking a page from Plato, and they get rid of anything they deem as pagan. It's all gone. Any type of instrumentation, like the Jewish tradition, remember they had harps and they had trumpets. They played those in the temple during sacrifices. It's all got to go. Because that could be for enjoyment. That could be too much fun. And we don't want to have fun. It's of the flesh, yeah. And so that was what Plato thought. It's what the church fathers thought when they first started the church. And now John Calvin's like, okay, we need to get back to our roots a little bit. Because there's another problem, and we're going to get to it in a sec. So the other thing I want to mention, I didn't make a slide for this because they didn't do a whole lot, but the Church of England, which came about so Martin Luther had a problem with the church. John Calvin had a problem with the church. Henry VIII also had a problem with the church, but it was a different problem. So we're going to have the Church of England. I'm going to be in charge. It's going to be way better. And they didn't do a whole lot differently musically, but it's worth noting that we're no longer, their music, instead of calling it the Mass, they call it a service. And so that's where our service comes from. We're going to have a service, and that's the name for all the music we're going to create for our church service. The other thing that they have, they're also going to have congregational singing, but there's going to be a specific piece that's going to be very probably polyphonic and a lot more complex, and the choir's going to sing it, and we're going to call it the anthem. And that's when that word came into use in the church.
So anthems were allowed in the Calvinist tradition?
No.
Oh.
No, I'm the Church of England.
Gotcha.
Sorry, I'm still on the wrong slide. Hold on. So the Catholic Church sees all this happen, and they're like, well, we're going to have a little meeting, and that meeting's going to take about 20 years. And what they basically, Council of Trent, they meet, and they pretty much decide, you know what? We should keep doing what we're doing. These heretics are making fools of themselves. We're going to keep doing what we're doing, except they almost got rid of polyphony, but for a completely different reason. It wasn't about focus on God alone. They loved the signification of power that it gave to the church, but polyphony can make it kind of difficult to understand the words. So, but nothing came of it.
You're doing it all in Latin anyway. It wasn't their native language.
Well, you know.
It seemed like they were that concerned about it.
They wanted to make sure you could hear the Latin. So, but again, nothing really was said about music. So this is actually where I'm going to leave the Catholic Church alone, because they kept kind of doing things as they were. they started to add more parts, music became even more complex, even more crazy. But in terms of actual real change in music, not a whole lot happened. The Italian madrigal, 16th century. I completely forgot to pull up a video on this one. So the distribution of sheet music made this possible. This is actually secular song outside the church. And all that I need you to know about this, it came from Italy, and what they really started to do here, they wanted to create music that specifically matched the words. So if I'm singing about a rainstorm, then I want the music to kind of sound like a rainstorm. I completely forgot to bring up a video that shows this. I'll try to do it next week. But it actually was a really big deal and allowed Italy to take the lead in European music. So it made Italy a superpower in European music, and that's what did it. Moving on, instrumental music. We talked about this a little while ago. And we have a lot of instruments that are about to be invented. Instrumental works could be played by homogeneous ensembles, meaning a whole bunch of instruments that are all the same, or more varied collections, specifically instruments, specific instruments were not specified by the composer. So I'm gonna write a 4-part instrumental work, but I didn't write it for violin and viola or whatever. I wrote it a soprano part, an alto part, a tenor part, and a bass part, and you can play whatever instrument you want. Let's talk about a couple of these instruments. First of all, medieval things that have actually been around. Pretty much trumpets, flutes, and recorders. And they look like that. And then we're going to invent a few more. So first of all, the lute, it already existed in Arabic nations. It was called the oud. And so they go on a couple of crusades, and they figure out, oh, wow, there's this new instrument that we've never seen before, and we're going to bring it home with us, and we're going to call it a lute or a lute. And it actually becomes the most popular household instrument. It's small, it can play a whole bunch of different notes, it can do a whole bunch of different things at the same time. It sounds like this. That one little thing, it can play the melody and the harmony all at the same time. And very pretty, right? So that countenance and glois, that very pretty sound, has made it to all music by this period. What are those? They are called viols. And these guys have been around since about the 15th century, about the 1400s. And they come in all sizes. You see a little one here, a little one on the right, the big one in the middle. And so you got like a soprano viol and an alto viol and a tenor viol and a bass viol. And they kind of have this mellow, stringy sound. They're very, very nice. And for more serious music making, sounds like this. Kind of a mellow, not too bright, not too exciting, just nice and perfect for the courts, perfect for the church, a church setting, if you're allowed to have them. So a very, very serious section of instruments for more serious music, like in the church and the court, stuff like that. The viols actually have a distant cousin, so these were invented in about the 1400s. In the 1400s and the 1500s, they have a more kind of a folksier cousin, like a distant cousin. But it's not really for serious music. It's more for dance, kind of rustic, peasant music. It's a little bit different. It's called the violin. And this is called a saltarello, which is from saltare, which means to jump. And it was a popular dance in Italy during the Renaissance. So you can hear the difference between the viols and the more bright, piercing sound of the violin. A little bit more fun, too. Honest answer, who can tell the difference between the sound of the first one and the second one, like the actual tone of the instrument? Yeah, they're kind of the same.
Were there viols behind with the violin in this?
No, the violin family was all invented around the same time. So that's the violin, the actual viola, the cello, and the bass. So it's violin, probably some other violins, maybe a viola, harpsichord was in there. We'll get to that in a minute. The saxophone. Love to say that. This is another 16th century instrument. So the problem with trumpets is that they don't really have valves yet. You can't push anything to make different notes. They're kind of limited, and they can only play notes in the harmonic range. So the saxophone is kind of cool because you can actually change the size of the instrument using that slide. And that was invented, and now you have a brass instrument that can play more notes, a wider range of notes than the trumpet. So it's pretty cool. Sounds like this. That's actually a recorder on top. The last one that was invented, the harpsichord. Look at that. It uses quills to pluck each string, and it actually works really well as a solo instrument or in an ensemble. Clavichord was also invented, a slightly smaller keyboard instrument. It was softer. Clavichord was used for in-home use and actually used little hammers to strike little brass bars rather than using quills to pluck strings. So that's the harpsichord, the clavichord, these keyboard instruments. Not the first keyboard instruments because we already have the organ by now. So the Renaissance, keep in mind, it's not quite as profound change as the medieval period, but keep in mind that last week in an hour I covered from 0 all the way to like 1300. Tonight we only went from like 1300 to like 1600. Yeah, so it's a lot for 300 years, right? And music itself did change. You added some parts. The madrigal was invented. You had the biggest thing from an idea standpoint is that the Greeks had this idea that music was more than just like a mathematical configuration of notes. Music could be a language and it could express something, right? And through these prettier sounds and through the power of having different voices, through the power of sheet music, through the power of this idea of text depiction. Text depiction just means that we're going to try to convey an idea through music, okay? So for the first time in thousands of years, music is again at this place where we're going to try to use it as a language by itself. Does that make sense? and it's going to be beautiful, or it's going to convey grief, or it's going to convey happiness, or it's going to convey I don't know. And that is a major difference between the music of this period and that thing going on in the medieval period. How about that? Any questions? They weren't all the same. Not as many as the piano.
The early organs, did they have a keyboard that looked like our current keyboard?
Not all of them, but it came along pretty quickly. What is important about the organ is that it started out as a movable, you could move it around. It was very, 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 very small. And so you could pack it up and take it with you. It was several hundred years later, and it actually existed in a kind of primitive state during the medieval period. And it was around 1300 they started building them into things. Notre Dame got this huge thing built in like the 1400s or so. Yes?
You talked about the anthem as being the piece done in multiple voices by the choir, even though there was congregation singing. It seems that the last couple of weeks in the order of worship, it says special music rather than anthem. Is that a difference, or was that left over from the summer when we didn't have the choir, we had different people doing different things?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. It would appear that might have been left over from the summer period. Thanks for letting us know. Huh? Yes, we're taking music history in the next direction. We are living music history today.
This is a very interesting debate, though, within the church, whether we should, if the anthem is a form of special music, maybe we just call it special music and be more inclusive to visitors, non-churchy people who are like, what the heck is an anthem? And then same with the word hymn. I attempted to use song of praise in my last church, and people said, why don't you use the word hymn anymore? That's a church word. And I said, well, that means a song of praise. So but it's who's your audience? Who are you trying to include? That all has to do with that bulletin language is all about that stuff. It's really interesting. Yes, you are.
By the way, the word hymn and what it means, praise to God, a song of praise to God, or honestly, a song of praise to a God, predates everything I've talked about, except maybe the scale system from Mesopotamia, because our kind of diatonic scale came from like Babylon. So hymn is very, 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 very old, like thousands and thousands of years. So.
Did you talk last week, I might have missed it, about the way meter works and like time and everything like that? Yeah, that
Yeah.
was fascinating. So it seems to me that like also writing down music on paper might fix it more than if it's just like an oral tradition kind of.
Mm-hmm. As soon as the clock was invented and as soon as we had written music, then all of a sudden we could come up with different ways. We figured out, it doesn't all have to be the same. We can make it different if we want. It was always in triple meter. Da 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 1 2 3 ba da 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 da. It was always in 3, and we realized, maybe we could have it in 2. Da 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 da. Or maybe we could make it twice as slow, or we could make it twice as fast, and we could do, or maybe the countertenor sings twice as fast, and the tenor goes really slow, or one goes in 3 and one goes in 2, and we wound up in 2024. So, Mark.
You know the novelty kind of song where, people sing words, but they sound like some kind of instrument? The trumpet goes toot, someone else.
Yeah.
Violin, and was there an equivalent of that kind of stuff going on that's polyphony, but it seems like something that folk people, would do for
Like they mimic the sounds of the instruments?
No, they don't make the sounds, but they go any novelty song where, this group is going to do this part. You're going to go, pa pa, and this one's going to da 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 da, and the other one is going to do. I'm sure you
So
must have done songs like that at camp or something like that. No, no one was on camp.
so what year was Camp Julian founded? Was that before or after 800, 8800? A little bit after, I can't remember. So I will say that even after sheet music was invented, I'm glad you asked this. I can't tell you percussion parts were still just kind of made up. Composers wrote down like soprano, alto, tenor bass parts. People still got together and said, you're going to do, not everything was written down. You still had folk musicians getting together. They went to church. They heard how music could be done. And they heard, 4 different parts and how it all kind of fit together. This kind of pa pa, like, oh, you're going to be like kind of a accompaniment, and I'm going to be the melody, and you're going to accompany me, because that's a accompaniment. Bum, bop, 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 and you're going to, that hasn't been invented yet. This idea of this kind of supporting role. What's important, the tenor has the melody, but all 4 parts and those textures are equally important. They're all like little melodies that weave in and out of each other. And that's really important to understand. We don't have like a solo and then accompaniment at this point. And that's not going to show up until like the mid 1700s. That's like Mozart and Haydn. We'll get to that next week.
Interesting, because I imagine that corresponded with the notion of the individual being so important. An individual voice, why would that voice be more important than the other melody lines?
The idea of an individual voice is a relatively
There are very specific cultural differences is why that came about, and I can't wait to tell you all next week. Because then we go from the Renaissance to the Baroque period to the classical period. So tonight I went through about 200 years of music. Last week was 1,000 years, but not a whole lot happened in that 1,000 years, so it's okay. Tonight I did 200 years. Next week it will be my job to go through about 500 years, and a whole lot happened. And we're going to skip a whole lot, but basically my plan for next week, at this point, a lot of the major church branches have been the Protestants came, and anything that isn't here took their inspiration, at least from Martin Luther. A lot of the major musical things have happened, like our sense of harmony is here. Think about it, we have our harmonies. Harmonies are here. Sheet music is here. Instrumental music is here. A whole bunch. I mean, the sax boot is the trombone. It's a predecessor of the trombone. We have the violin. We have our flutes. We have our trumpets. All the instruments are here. Harpsichord's here. After this, there's so many stylistic changes, which I'm really excited about, because that's actually the reason why I did this class, was because Serena walked in several months ago and asked me what the difference was between Beethoven and Mozart. So I get to do that next week. Any other questions? Did that answer your question at all? Because maybe we need to go. Maybe we need to get like go.
I'm still on this kick that
We might need to go have a drink.
folk music happening underground, but you gave me an answer to that last week, which was, well, there was folk music, but they took their influence from church music.
So remember, hold on. This is folk music. This is folk music 100%. The violin was not, if I brought a violin into church, well, actually it's funny because we do this all the time, so I shouldn't have said this. It would be like if I brought a violin, no, imagine me bringing an electric guitar into First Church. And I'm gonna play, all right, Trudy, I'm gonna play some electric guitar. And here we go. I'm gonna play some Johnny Cash. That would be like me taking the violin into any like kind of serious venue back in the Middle Ages. It was a sort of, it was the common man's viol. It was dance music. This and the saltarello, this Italian dance, that was folk music of the period. If you listen to the chords, actually, since you asked. Bum, bum. It's a little bit simpler. You don't have all the little weaving lines. It's a lot simpler in structure than this guy. So that was your folk music.
So yeah, I'm starting to wonder, like, if I'm kind of with you here. I'm wondering if like gypsy music and things like that might have been a kind of a more underground.
I don't know if gypsy could really come under the category of Western music. I mean, clearly there was rhythmical music, all kinds of things that came from, Africa and.
Yeah.
Right, that was completely different.
If you're gonna do dance music in Europe, then there's meter. I mean, almost by definition, if you're gonna do a dance, unless it's ballet, I guess.
Yes, meter kind of creeps its way in, and that's instinctive.
It crept in from
So as soon as you have sheet music, then all of a sudden you start to get meter, you start to get all the different subdivisions of notes, of beats, and things like that. And also the clock has been invented, so people are starting to kind of get this idea of this ticking. But I think it's also important to realize we have this Western European tradition. Why I said music of Africa, music of Indonesia, music of Asia. Eastern Europe is also kind of grouped into that. So you had people went off after the Western Empire fell. You saw Constantinople, and you had the Byzantine Empire, and that is a completely different musical tradition. They do not have all of this increase in complexity that we do in the West. Anything else? So next week we'll go through we'll go from the Baroque to the Classical to the Romantic period to the 20th century, and I'm going to do it all in a little over an hour. Thank you all so much for coming.
I asked you that last week, but I thought it was DSL. That's what I thought, DSL, so I looked.